It struck me as I was preparing some notes for today that today is a very significant anniversary in Russia. Almost every family has been affected by what happened on June 22nd, 1941, when Hitler turned his armies against Russia. Um, the magnitude of that is exemplified in many ways, including the fact that 27 million, that's million with an M, 27 million Soviet citizens perished in World War II. Some of you know that. I have known that for a while, but I didn't learn that in school, curiously enough. Today, there was a breakdown of those figures between Army casualties, that is, armed forces casualties, and civilians. It's 8 million military, 19 million civilians. Now, prominent people have written on this occasion about, well, asking why does everything stop on June 22nd? Why do Russians customarily have a lump in their throat? Well, because everyone suffered the effects of that or had a family associated with that. Just by comparison, if you look at U.S. casualties during World War II, the latest figure is about 420,000. Okay, all military, of course, and no destruction to speak of if you didn't live in Honolulu, of our mainland, certainly, and of America. A little footnote there. The Russian Foreign Minister, Sergei Lavrov, has warned the United States several months ago, look, you've been lucky. You have been able to hide behind two great oceans. That's not the case anymore. Just by way of saying that the Russians are not only supremely aware of the luck the U.S. has had, even when it embroiled itself in European conflicts, but the fact that this is not the case anymore. And not only that, but the people that are ruling the U.S., at least right now, have no experience of war. How many deferments did Cheney have? 5. How many deferments did Biden have? 5. Did Blinken, Secretary of State, or Assistant to the President for National Security Affairs, Sullivan, have any military service? No. Did they ever wear a uniform? I haven't checked the Boy Scout record, but as far as I can tell, no. This speaks this speaks to the Russian leadership, which says, my God, this American history, uh, they did a great job against the British, helped by the French. But outside of that, and especially during this last century, they've had the kind of experience in war that has been not all that distinguished and not all that successful. What will they try this time? Now, this terrific group here at the Community Church of Boston, I'm indebted to them for these lectures and hearing Daniel Ellsberg and all manner of really, really wonderful people speaking here. And they've had these kinds of lectures for a long time. What I wanted to refer to is something that now escapes me, but the idea is that what we discuss here openly needs to be gotten around, spread around, because it's the truth. Now, how do I say this? Well, uh, by by luck, while I was a senior in college, 1960 and 1961, uh, I was taking Russian as a foreign language. Really, really liked it. And despite all the people told me to major in economics, I chose Russian with some good advice, and that was graduated 61. So it was a pretty interesting development and a nice thing to have when I went into Army intelligence and then served with the CIA. When I retired, it was 1990. Now, you all know that the Berlin Wall fell in November 1989. My God, the euphoria. Eastern Europe free after a while. The Soviet Union falling apart. Now, I had become just old enough to retire, special retirement provision for those who had served enough time overseas. And so I chose to retire, patting myself on the back, saying, good work, Ray. Now, others cooperated, of course, but our main target, the Soviet Union, has imploded. And the euphoria that attended this was very palpable, okay? What happened, of course, was that the guys from Wall Street and the guys from Harvard, the Harvard boys, came in and exploited this very naive drunk named Yeltsin, pretty much plundered the natural resources, the companies in Russia, and they went through a decade from 1990 to 2000 of pretty abject poverty and just kind of being plundered. Now, one little statistic that I often raise in this respect is the average age that a Russian male died. Okay, there's a name for that. I'll think of it. Okay, now in 1991, it was 83. In 1995, it was 77. These are World Bank figures, okay? Think of it, that disparity in just 6 years. So Russia was on its back, and it was Putin, by some kind of providence, who came into power, completely unexpected, but he built Russia up to what it is today. Now, let me just say that I had the good luck to be in Yalta, in Crimea, in June of 2016, so about 8 years ago now. And we were the first U.S. delegation to visit Russia since all the travel restrictions and all the strict measures against Russia were imposed after we overthrew the government in Kiev, and the Russians expressed their dislike for that. Okay, so what happened was we happened to be there on this day, the 22nd of June, and there was a big celebration of kind, a memorial really, at the public square in Kiev, and we were asked, "Oh, you're an American delegation. Why don't you come and say something?" And I I was the only Russian speaker in the delegation, so I dug into my memory of Russian poetry that I was exposed to at Fordham, and I dug out a poem by Poet Ruskoi Skorby, the poet of Russian grief. His name was Nekrasov. He lived and wrote the same time as Dostoevsky, but he's widely known as being the poet of Russian pain. Okay, and so it seemed to me that this might be appropriate for the occasion, and so in the little speech that I gave, I recited this. It's not very long. I'd like to do it for you now and then translate it. Okay. The title is Vnimayo Ужасом войны. Okay. Ужас, it's almost onomatopoeia, isn't it? Ужас is the horrors, the terrors, the awfulness. Vнимая, paying attention to the ужасом войны, of war, paying attention to the horrors of war. Внимая ужасом войны, При каждой новой жертве боя мне жаль не друга, не жены, мне жаль не самого героя. Увы, у тысячи жара, и друга лучший друг забудет. Но где-то есть душа одна, одна до гроба помнить будет. При лицемерных наших тел и всякой пошлости и прозы одни я в мире подсмотрел. Святые искренние слезы, то слезы бедных матерей. Им не забыть своих детей, погибших на кровавой Ниве, как не поднять плохую шаеве своих поникнувших ветвей. Okay. Paying attention to the horrors of war, with the killing of each new soldier, I feel sorry not so much for the girlfriend, not so much for the best friend, because girlfriends and best friends easily forget and go on to other things. There are only one kind of sincere, sacred tears, to слезы бедных матерей. Those are the tears of poor mothers. Им не забыть своих детей. They don't forget their children, погибших на кровавой Ниве, who perish on the bloody battlefield. And then finishing up, как не поднять плохую шаеве, just as a weeping willow tree cannot поднять, cannot lift its branches, so it is with the poor mothers whose children perish on the bloody battlefield. Now, that was one experience I had. Poignant it doesn't do it justice, because I saw, as I looked at that audience, most of the people were older than I. I was only 2 years old when the Nazis invaded Russia. Ed was just a gleam in his father's eye, okay? But most of these people were older than I. Many of them had spouses, fathers, grandparents who had suffered because of what happened that day in 1941. I want to recount one other instance where I was given a particularly personal insight into what it was like for Russia in World War II. Before that, I probably should just give you a little bit of background of things that I remember, having learned lots about Russian history and Russian politics and Russian war making and the invasions of Russia. Let me just very quickly say that Russia's history is just about 1,000 years old. If it weren't for two Greek priests from Macedonia, they would not have gotten a written language as soon as they did. That happened in the 9th and 10th century. They had a beautiful, they had an incredible epic poetry, but it was all oral. It was akin to Homeric poetry, but it was all oral tradition until these priests literally manufactured an alphabet for them. Then they had Old Church Slavonic and then later Russian itself. So that happened, and they started becoming part of civilization, Byzantium, and the West. And what happened? The Mongol hordes came in, 1240. How long they stay? 2 centuries plus 20 years. So while we're in the West getting out of the Dark Ages into the Renaissance, the Russians are still fighting off the Tatar, the Tatarske Iga, the Tartar yoke, get rid of all the. Then what happens? They're invaded by the Swedes, by the Lithuanians, by the Danes, by the Hanseatic League, and they have to fight them off. And if you remember Eisenstein's film about Alexander Nevsky and how they faced into that, Ivan IV got rid of them. Then what happened? Well, then we had World War I. Well, then we had Hitler, World War II. Okay, and now we have the danger, as they see it, of another invasion coming from the West, as as crazy as that seems, but when you have the French President Macron and others saying, well, yeah, we ought to send our own troops into Ukraine, that's the background of all this. And the little vignette I want to cite comes from being in Russia on the 25th of April, 75 years after the meeting on the Elbe River in Germany. Now, the Elbe, of course, is where Russian forces, American forces finally met after all that time, okay? We're talking April 25th, 1945, 3 weeks before victory, or 2 weeks before victory in Europe, okay? Now, what was that all about? Well, there was incredible cordiality and exchange of gifts. These two allies were bound at the hip because they had defeated the Nazi hordes. Now, the Russians pretty much don't like when June 6th comes in, and they say, with all due respect, that was very good, good invasion. But when the US and the UK regularly say, that was the turning point, we won the war starting on June 6th. Well, they don't like that. They don't like that because it's not true. The Russians had already turned the Nazi hordes back. And by previous agreement, 2 weeks after Normandy, the Russians mounted this incredible offensive Bagration, okay, in Belarus, in Belarusia, and decimated, well, eliminated 28 of 34 German armies in that offensive. So it was an Allied victory, okay, and the Russians rightly feel that they suffered the most, they did the most, they turned back the Nazis. It may have taken a little bit more time for them to finish off Hitler, and they welcomed the invasion in Normandy, but those were the facts. Now, I had a little insight into this when I spoke at a commemoration of the meeting on the Elbe in Moscow, and we were dedicating a special monument to mark that occasion. And I spoke. I actually recited the same poem. I'm getting a lot of mileage out of it. And this great big Soviet general, about 6'3", in full Soviet general regalia, comes up to me, and he looks at me and straight in the eye, and he says, "Studebaker, Studebaker, Studebaker," and he gives me this great big bear hug, a Russian bear hug, if you will. Now, what was that all about? Some of you would know that the automobile manufacturing plant in the Midwest, Studebaker, made quite good cars in those days. They turned over their whole manufacturing enterprise into making what we in the Army call deuce and a halfs, okay, 2.5-ton trucks, and all manner of other delivery systems, which through Iran and also through Alaska were shipped into Soviet forces and played a huge role in helping the Russians turn back the Germans. They could carry personnel, they could tow artillery, they could go through mountains, they could go through snow, and there are all kinds of pictures and everything about. And the Russians were extremely grateful for this. As a matter of fact, before the war ended, one of their generals wrote a letter to Studebaker, thanking Studebaker. So what I'm saying here is that there's this history behind us. Not many people know about it. And just to bring it right up to date, I would like to just cite that there was an apogee or an acme of U.S.-Russian relations in early September 2013. Any of you know about that? Well, let me say this, that Obama was smarter than most of his predecessors or successors. It was bad enough that he let himself be persuaded to double down in Afghanistan, but he didn't want to get involved in another war in Syria. So when a false flag attack arranged by special services of allied countries blamed Bashar al-Assad of Syria and said, this is the tripwire, this is the red line, Mr. President. You have to make open war against Bashar al-Assad, and you have to fire those tomahawks off from the Eastern Mediterranean. When that happened, Obama didn't want to do that. And he made the preposterous suggestion that before declaring war, he ought to really consult Congress. Yeah, now, that, of course, is what the Constitution provides, but it hadn't been done for a while, okay? So in the midst of all this, with John Kerry plumbing for open war against Syria, and Menendez in the Senate and the others all say, "Oh yeah, we got it. We got to hit him. What are you, a chicken?" By chance, Obama was invited to St. Petersburg to participate in one of these economic summits. Okay, now he had a meeting with Putin, and Putin said, "Thank you, Mr. President, for being reluctant to start yet another war." Let me tell you something, Mr. President. I think we can help. We've been talking to the Syrians, and we've persuaded the Syrians to destroy all their chemical weapons. They were very old. They probably didn't work, but we're going to destroy them. And they've agreed to let them be destroyed under UN supervision, UN inspection on the kind of ship, such as you have a couple of ships that are specifically outfitted for the destruction of chemical weapons. And Obama says, really? And Putin says, yeah, really. John Kerry knows we've been working on this. I don't know how much he's told you about it. Kerry was not with Obama, and that's key. Long story short, Obama says, it's a deal. Then the Syrians announced that they're going to do this, destroy all their chemical weapons. War is avoided. Okay. Later, Obama brags to one of his biographers. I was particularly proud of this because I didn't follow the Washington playbook. All my advisors said, you got to do this, and I resisted that. Now, why I mention all that? That was the high point of U.S.-Russian relations recently. And on September 12th, while this was just going down, okay, in other words, Obama and Putin had already met the week before, figured this all out. Putin wrote an op-ed for the New York Times. Whoa, op-ed for the New York Times. I have it somewhere here. There it is. Now, the whole thing was an expression of satisfaction that there had grown between the two a modicum of trust where they could face into major situations like this and work out a sensible agreement. Now, I was reliably informed at the time that Putin penned or typed out the last paragraph himself. So this is what the last paragraph said, and I think it's very, very relevant to what we're going to discuss now. Earlier, he had said, look, if we can avoid force in Syria, this will improve the atmosphere in international affairs and strengthen mutual trust. It will be our shared success and open the door to cooperation on other critical issues. Last paragraph. My working and personal relationship with President Obama is marked by growing trust. I appreciate this. I carefully studied his address to the nation on Tuesday, and I have to say that I disagree with the case he made on American exceptionalism, saying that the United States policy is what makes America different. It's what makes us exceptional. It's extremely dangerous to encourage people to see themselves as exceptional, whatever the motivation. There are big countries and small countries, rich and poor, those with long democratic traditions, and those still trying to find their way to democracy. Their policies differ too. We're all different, but when we ask for the Lord's blessings, we must not forget that God created us equal, period, end quote. Growing trust. My God, the people that Obama had to deal with, the neoconservatives, Hillary Clinton and Victoria Nuland and John Kerry, they didn't want growing trust. And it took them all of 6 months to overthrow the government in Kiev. Victoria Nuland bragging in December of that same year that we had invested $5 billion, billion with a B, in helping Ukraine's strivings for democracy. So it was the coup that put the kibosh on this growing trust, and Obama is apparently unable to appreciate the significance of this, but that's where it all started going down. We'll be talking about Ukraine, I'm sure, as Ed will have a lot of questions. But I wanted to start out by saying, look, there's no real reason that the US and Russia could not get together. As a matter of fact, we did precisely that back in World War II, as most people should know if they don't. And we can do it again. We prevented a war in Syria. Later, the Russians came into Syria at the Syrians' request to help the war not spread, okay? So there's lots to be said about this. This is an anniversary that I think people should be aware of. And to the extent that people understand how Kremlin leaders, and that was my job, okay, for more decades than I will admit to, that was my job, put myself in the shoes of Kremlin leaders and figure out how they're looking at things. And I fear that Kremlin leaders today are looking at what they think are irresponsible and unpredictable people, don't know anything about war, are very politically in jeopardy because of what's going on in Ukraine, and may even resort to low yield nuclear weapons to stave off defeat in Ukraine. Would I put it past these guys? No, I wouldn't. And it doesn't matter what McGovern thinks. That is what Putin and those generals and admirals that he has breathing down his neck, it matters what they think. And that's where we are today. It's a very delicate situation. And thanks for listening. I didn't mean to go on at this length.